Welcome to Episode 4 of the EPIC series, UCC Course Approval, Development, and Assessment. In this episode, we're going to look at the critical thinking assignment, the questions I developed for that assignment, and the rubric. You need to watch Episode 3 first to get an idea of what went on during the assignment. Also, for this video, you want to have a copy of the critical thinking rubric with you. I do have a picture of it on here, but it's just so small that it's not going to show up very well. So as a refresher, remember we took an article from a book or a podcast that had a critical thinking question involved with it, had them develop the question, had to go through the two viewpoints, had to look at the shades of gray. They then had to do the known facts and unknown facts and find answers. They then had to look at the stakeholders and what values would govern them. Then had to put in the tugs, whatever pulled them towards one side, had to list all the tugs on both sides for what pulled them towards a certain viewpoint. Then they came up with their viewpoint, they looked at the context, they looked at the values of their viewpoint. From this worksheet then, we're going to look at the rubric, which again, you need a copy of with you. And we're going to look at the questions I developed for this assignment. Now, I'll tell you, the first time I did it, and I looked at their answers, I couldn't make the questions fit with the rubric as well as I would have liked. So actually, after I did it the first time, I actually changed the questions to try to make it fit better. I have a feeling that I'll probably be changing those questions a little bit in the future again to try to pull the answers from them that we're looking for in order to use the rubric and to really look at their critical thinking skills. So here are my questions. Here are the first four. First thing they have to do is explain the dilemma of the question and explain why it is a dilemma. The second question is describe the different viewpoints within the dilemma, explain why each creates questions that must be answered. Now, after the question, what you will see is you will see which section of the rubric that I'm going to use when I read their answer. So explanation of the problem, come back to the rubric, I read those two answers that they've written down, and then I give it a score based on this domain of the rubric, or this dimension of the rubric. So again, I use those two questions. What I found is, and this is what I found the first time, is that you really, when they're first doing this, your questions have to be very specific. So you're pulling out of them what they need to be able to, what they need in order to answer the questions. You really need to make your questions very specific so they start to learn the pattern of what they need to do to be a good critical thinker. So that for 1 and 2, I'd use that dimension, that first dimension. What is your viewpoint on the issue? Consider the shades of gray options. Write out your viewpoint in a complete sentence. I would use question 3 to partially grade students' position. Now, them writing it in one sentence, I'm not going to get a ton of information to help me with this dimension, but I will get more help from the questions I'm going to ask them beyond just that one sentence they're going to write for question 3. Question 4, how do different contexts, and I give you a list, influence your viewpoint? And if you notice on the rubric, there is the influence of context and assumptions. I will also tell you this is probably one of the weakest areas they had on the first assignment we did like this. They can tell you that they just kind of listed, oh, my age affects my decision, my family background affects my decision. But what they didn't do a good job of is they didn't do a good job of explaining why. They didn't look at their own thinking. So what I told them is I want you to think about your thinking. Why do you think the way you do? And describe how those contexts influence your decisions. What I ended up doing with the first one, and the first one we did wasn't with marijuana. It was actually dealing with an issue of a minor making a medical decision for themselves that would actually lead to their death. And so what I did is I gave them an example. I gave them 3 contexts for me. I talked about how my age affects my decision, how my scientific background affected my decision, and how my religious beliefs affected my decision. So what they don't do well is they don't describe their context. So you might find you'll have that same situation. That is the hardest to get across to them. So that takes care of that section of the rubric. What factual information supports your viewpoint? Explain. Again, that's going to be under the evidence section up here. So when they answer those questions, I will look at those questions and use this to assess their skills at using evidence. Describe at least one viewpoint on the issue that differs from yours. This is a key to critical thinking skills. They have to be able to describe the other issue, the facts, the principles, the values that support the other side of the viewpoint. So this again ties into a couple sections of the rubric, the student's position. If you read along here, you'll see that they have to be able to describe the opposite side. So that comes from that question. And then the last question, if your viewpoint was followed, what would be the implications and consequences, the good and bad, for the appropriate stakeholders and all of society? Now this section of that rubric, the last section that you can see on the copy you have, is not on this PowerPoint, but it has them look at the implications and consequences. So they're very good at describing what they believe are the positives of their viewpoint. What they tend to be weaker in is describing the negatives. So if their viewpoint was taken by society, what effect would it have on the stakeholders, good and bad, and on society, good and bad? And again, they think many times their viewpoint doesn't have any negative consequences. But to be a good critical thinker, they need to think through that process. Real quick, I do want to show you on here where they can pull the information for each question. So I'm going to be flipping back and forth. But explain the dilemma, describe the different viewpoints for questions 1 and 2. That comes from here. Here's your question. Here's your viewpoints right in here. So they can pull question 1 and 2 from that. Question 3, what is your viewpoint? That was on the bottom of that page. How do your different contexts influence your decision? Again, if we go back to that front page, here's what their viewpoint is. Here's the context. Now what they've done here is they've listed their context. There's not a way for them to explain why. That may be a modification I make in this form, is to put more space there so they can discuss the different contexts, or at least put a little more information than just listing them. Question 5, what factual information supports your viewpoint? And that they get from here. So they have their facts listed. They do a good job with this, then they should have no problem describing the facts that support their viewpoint. Then they have to describe one viewpoint on the issue that differs from theirs. Where they get that from is they get it from the tugs. So if they believe this side, they need to look at their tugs here, go through a description of the other viewpoint, giving the facts and the ethical principles and the values that support the opposite viewpoint. And question 7, if your viewpoint was followed, what would be the implications and consequences? There's really not a section on that form that allows them to do that, but hopefully when they look at that form and they look at the two viewpoints, they see the tugs, they can start thinking about the positive and negatives of their viewpoint. So again, these are the questions I use in order to assess critical thinking using the critical thinking rubric. Again, just a reminder that when I look at this dimension of the rubric and I give it a grade, or I circle how they did, I'm also assessing this state outcome. So for all of these, remember, when you're giving a score on this dimension, you're also assessing the state outcomes that are listed for each of those dimensions.